The Jets are 2-5, and things feel bleak right now. But is there a way to turn it around? That's for Aaron Rodgers to decide. Let's discuss today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and our episode today is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, today we have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Let's start with our first question about potentially turning the Jets around. We are clearly not a good football team, but I think in addition to being mediocre, we have also been a bit unlucky in some key plays. With our soft remaining schedule, it feels like if our luck turns around a little bit, we could get on a streak. So the question is, am I just drinking the Kool-Aid here? I'm not expecting playoffs, just to actually enjoy the rest of the season. Well, if the season ended right now, the Jets would have a top 5 pick in the NFL draft. Jets would actually own the 5th overall pick. I don't expect the Jets to end the season picking top 5. And one of the big reasons for that is that the schedule is about to get easier. The Jets have in some ways been unlucky, but I think that can be overstated. I've seen people say, oh, well, we're a couple plays away from being 5-2. Well, that may be accurate. But the Jets are also a couple of plays from being 1-6 because they very easily could have lost that game to the Tennessee Titans. You can't assume that every single play is going to go your way over the course of the season. You can't assume you're going to get every single break. You can't assume every close game is going to go in your direction. Look, right now, the Jets are 21st in point differential. They're 21st in DVOA. They've won one game in blowout fashion. There's really no sign that this is a team that's drastically better than its record right now. I think you can make the argument because they are 1-3 in one-score games. Maybe they're a little unlucky to not be 3-4, but this team has still fallen way short of expectations. Now, the question is phrased in a very careful way, and I think the question is phrased in a very realistic way because at this point, making the playoffs is going to be very difficult to do. You know, if we assume that it's going to take 10 wins to get in the playoffs in the AFC like it did a year ago, so that would mean the Jets would need to go 10-7. Right now, they're 2-5. So 10 games left. That means you have to go 8-2 the rest of the way. You have to play 800 ball. Let's say, because the AFC is looking a little shakier this year than it did last year, maybe 9-8 gets you in. Well, even to get there, the Jets have to go 7-3 the rest of the way. So they'd have to play 700 ball. And I know that the schedule is probably going to get easier. Now, one factor is that the Jets play Miami twice, and the Miami team that the Jets will play if Tua Tagovailoa is the quarterback is different from the Miami team we've seen to this point in the season. So those two games are going to be tougher than Miami's performance to date would indicate. That's assuming Tua is in the lineup and able to play in those games. And while I think the Jets will win games, because I just think that there is too much talent on this team to not beat some of the opponents they're facing, starting this Sunday against the New England Patriots. I mean, the Patriots are a team, we've seen the Jets crush them once this year. It's a team with little talent. And beyond that, I'd be really worried about this game if the Patriots looked like a team that was clicking, that was getting better every week. And we're going to talk to our buddy Mike Debate tomorrow on our crossover show, but all the indications out of Foxborough right now are that there's a lot of turmoil in the Patriots locker room. So it's a bad team that doesn't seem to be in great harmony right now. So the Jets should beat New England. And there are other winnable games on the schedule. The problem is that to win at the rate it would take to save this season, the Jets would need to be a team that looks like they could actually put together a decent performance against teams that aren't New England. And we just haven't seen that this year. It's easy to say this team's a couple plays from being 5-2, but it's not because the Jets played at a super high level. It's because other teams tried to hand Jets the games. The only two opponents the Jets have faced who have played well this year, I think, are San Francisco and Pittsburgh. And both those teams blew the Jets out. The other issue I see is that one of the biggest reasons the Jets are underperforming is that this roster is not as good as we were hoping it would be. We all off season, like from March through September, we use the phrase on paper. And one of the things about on paper is that it assumed guys like Aaron Rodgers and Tyron Smith and Mike Williams would play close to their career peak levels. And that's clearly not happening right now. And of these guys, I think Rodgers is the biggest issue. I mean, the trade for Devontae Adams almost makes Mike Williams an afterthought. Tyron Smith's an issue, of course, but the quarterback position, the Jets just aren't getting what they need. Rodgers, if you look statistically, every major stat in his career, he's either putting up the worst numbers of his career or the second worst numbers of his career. And that doesn't count like that counts seasons where he started an appreciable number of games. So we take out last year, we take out the first couple of years in Green Bay when he was backing up Brett Favre. But in years where he's been a starting quarterback, where he's been the primary starting quarterback for his team, every single thing he's done in 2024 is either the worst level or the second worst level. We're talking statistically. And I think there are reasons for that. I mean, you watch him play, he seems very, very nervous in the pocket. It looks like he's trying to avoid hits. He's checking everything down. He's getting rid of the ball as quickly as possible. Of course, his mobility is greatly reduced. That's also hurting things. Next Gen Stats has Rodgers with the second quickest time to throw in the league. Now, that's kind of a neutral stat. It's not necessarily the end of the world. But Rodgers also has the sixth fewest air yards per attempt in the league, according to Next Gen Stats. And historically, he's been one of the quarterbacks one of the most frequent deep throwers in the league. Back in his prime, back in his MVP days, he'd like to throw the ball down the field, and part of that was he was able to extend plays with his legs. Another part of it, which we talk a lot about, his lack of mobility. We talk a lot about his hesitation to be hit because of his body having a difficult time recovering from the pounding of an NFL season. One thing we don't talk a lot about is in Green Bay, he always had great offensive lines. And I actually think the Jets are playing pretty well in pass protection. Not so much in run blocking, but even despite the horror show that is Tyron Smith right now, the Jets are actually like collectively pass protecting pretty well. But I don't know that they're pass protecting at the level he got in Green Bay. In Green Bay, he had a pristine offensive line for much of his career. And the only real time where he struggled during his career, he had like a slump in like 2015 and 2016 in that range. And that was the point where his offensive line was it was like the one point in his career where his offensive line was kind of shaky in Green Bay. And all these things add up with him being 40 and him playing this style, and there really not being much of a way he can change it. And the offensive line, actually, I think playing pretty well, but maybe not at the level he's used to. It just makes me doubtful the Jets can turn this thing around, because I don't see how that gets fixed. It feels like the deeper we get into the season, the more he struggles, because the more the hits start to add up. If the Jets are going to turn this thing around, it starts with Aaron Rodgers. It can't happen without Aaron Rodgers getting back to something approaching the level he played at in 2020 and 2021. The thing is, you might say that's only 3-4 years ago. 3-4 years is a really long time in the NFL. That's an eternity in the NFL, 3-4 years, especially for a player of Rodgers' age. Sometimes it goes quickly. I think the Jets are hoping Devontae Adams unlocks something. And I think they traded for him just because of the chemistry. Historically, Devontae Adams has been one of the best yak guys in the league, yards after catch, YAC. So if you're doing a get it out quickly offense, you want guys who can run after the catch. The challenge is that Adams himself is 31, about to be 32. So is he going to produce at the same level? The Jets have a lot of old guys. We talked about this a lot in the offseason. A lot of old guys they were leaning on, hoping they wouldn't decline. Unfortunately, a lot of the old guys are showing signs of decline, and we'll see what Devontae Adams can do. Not a very impressive first game, though. So I think it's really tough to see the Jets turning around. If they do, Rodgers just has to somehow find the fountain of youth. He has to figure out a way to be able to push the ball down the field. And I just don't know that that's in the cards. If your question is, can the Jets look like a more competent team? Can they win some games? Can they avoid a top 5 pick? I think they will be able to. But the fact that we're talking about that as like a realistic best case scenario, very disappointing, I have to say. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the owner, Woody Johnson. And, if you listen to yesterday's podcast, I had an awful lot to say about Woody Johnson, how I'm not a big fan of him. But one question is, why are the Jets so unsuccessful now when they were actually relatively successful the first decade or so Woody owned the team? There are reasons for that. I'll tell you what they are as we continue here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time's the best place to go to get tickets to the events you want to attend. And Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I tell you about Game Time a lot, but I'm a customer. I've used Game Time on a number of occasions. Every single time I've used it, it's just been a couple hours before my event. I pulled out my phone and I've gotten amazing deals every single time using Game Time. You want to go see the Jets Sunday when they play in Foxborough? Game Time is the place to go to get in on the action. And my favorite part of Game Time is that they give you a picture of what your seat's going to look like. So when you get to your venue, there's no surprises, no obstructed views you weren't expecting. Everything's exactly what it seems, and you get a great deal because that's how Game Time works. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is also brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less than on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. Run your game all season long on Prize Picks. Prize Picks is the best way to get in on the action in over 30 states, including California, Florida, Georgia, and Texas. Sign up today and you'll get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. And Prize Picks is the best way to win real money this football season. Which players are going off, which ones aren't? Make your picks in less than 60 seconds and turn your sports opinions into real money all season long on Prize Picks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL, to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, run your game. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Greatly appreciate your support, especially on the Jets season that's disappointed us all. Let's continue now with our weekly mailbag. And our next question is about Woody Johnson. And if you listened to yesterday's show, I gave you quite a speech about my views about Woody Johnson, but there's one question about it. It's crazy to think how much success the Jets had from the late 90s through 2010 and 2011. That's a significant amount of time. We never won the Super Bowl, but multiple AFC Championship game appearances came in that time, multiple playoff appearances as well. We were actually competitive for a legitimate stretch. Woody was the owner for much of that stretch. What happened? That's a great question, and I don't want to oversimplify things, but there are a few things that really come to mind here. And the biggest thing for me is that the structure Bill Parcells built was still largely in place, because you have to remember Bill Parcells remained the Jets general manager through the year 2000. He retired after the 99 season, and that was a whole story you may be familiar with. He retired because he was afraid New England was going to hire Bill Belichick. Belichick was his defensive coordinator with the Jets. So he quit so that he could elevate Belichick to the head coach, prevent him from going to New England, and Belichick resigned anyway and went to New England anyway. So Al Groh took over the team, but Parcells remained the GM through the year 2000. And while Parcells' personnel record is actually pretty mixed, and Parcells was not a great GM, he did have one phenomenal draft. It was his last draft in the year 2000 when he drafted in the first round Chad Pennington and John Abraham and Sean Ellis. And in the third round that year, he drafted Lavernius Coles. And one draft can make a big, big difference for your football team. And the core that Parcells drafted, kind of kept that team in really good shape for years to come. And Parcells made some other good moves to keep the team competitive. So Woody inherited a lot from Bill Parcells. And the other aspect of this is that Parcells kind of helped the general manager search when Woody was hired. And they brought in Terry Bradway. And, Terry Bradway was not a great GM. You hear Jets fans, if you weren't around in those days, Terry Bradway got a lot of complaints. And there's not really a lot of fond memories of Terry Bradway. But Terry Bradway was a step above guys like John Idzik and Mike McCagnon. And he did make some good moves during his tenure. He kept the roster at he didn't handle the cap well. He made a lot of big mistakes. There was some free agents he should have landed that he did not land. Some big mistakes in the draft. Some things that were incomprehensible, like the Jets not knowing that Dwayne Robertson, who was the guy they traded up into the top 5 to get a defensive tackle, didn't realize he had a knee-on-knee condition. I mean, a lot of bad things happened with Terry Bradway. But he did bring in some talent. It wasn't all bad with Bradway. And Mike Tannenbaum took over. And again, Tannenbaum was not a great GM, but he had his moments. And one of those moments was the 2006 draft where he drafted Brickashaw, Ferguson, and Nick Mangold. And then the 2007 draft where he brought in Darrelle Revis and David Harris. So, another core that kind of sustained the Jets. If you look at where this thing's really started to fall off for the Jets, it's when that 06 draft core started getting old. The last few years of DeBrickashaw and Mangold, David Harris, and Revis had left by then. And that was the point where things started to go off the rails. And you also have to remember that Mike Tannenbaum was a guy brought into the organization by Parcells. So things ended poorly with Tannenbaum. He was too short-sighted in a lot of his moves, but he was able to, at least for the short term, kind of get results at a higher level. Tannenbaum eventually gets fired at the end of the 2012 season. And this is the first time Woody's really on his own. This is really the first time where Woody takes control. And that's where things started to fall apart, because that was when Woody said, well, I'm going to keep Rex Ryan around. And, well, that's how you end up with someone like John Idzik. That's why nobody qualified wanted the job then. And this is the point where Woody, without the guardrails in place, without that Parcells infrastructure, he starts dictating decisions. We have to trade Revis. He sets up structures that, aren't conducive to the team winning. The Idzik Rex dynamic, Bowles and McCagnon, who don't really work well together. Gase and McCagnon with his brother, Woody went to the UK, so put his brother in charge, which was the genius move. They hire Adam Gase, again, another genius move. Pair him with Mike McCagnon. The two of them can't work together to the point where McCagnon gets fired before the head coach GM combo even have one game together. So I think a lot of it, just like the infrastructure Parcells built, faded. And once that faded, like, there were at least some guardrails in place during the early parts of Woody's tenure. There was an infrastructure that Parcells had built, and slowly that started to fade away. And once it did, it became all about Woody. And that's what got us into the situation we're in right now. So I think that's the reason, because you're right. And, back around 2011, a lot of people were complaining about Woody. I was actually defending him because the team actually had a decent amount of success in his early tenure. The first 10, 11 years of Woody Johnson's ownership, Jets didn't win the Super Bowl. Jets weren't, a top team in the league. They probably weren't one of the top 5 organizations, but they were probably an above average, team in terms of the success they had. They were in the playoffs a lot, a couple deep playoff runs. But it's ever since what Parcells built faded, now it's all about Woody. And that's kind of how you get in the situation that you're in. And just not good. Next question. Where's Joe Douglas? Is he in witness protection? Rich Cimini thinks teams would be interested in him this offseason as a general manager, but that seems ridiculous to me based on the team's performance and his track record in the draft and free agency. Thoughts? Any chance he's the Jets GM next year? So, a number of questions there. First, where's Joe Douglas? That's a great question. I don't know where Joe Douglas is. I mean, the team in the last 2 weeks, they've fired their head coach. They've made a trade for a huge name wide receiver. They've ended like a holdout that's been generating headlines. And where's the GM? I haven't heard from the GM once, unless I'm mistaken. He hasn't spoken to the press once. He's been like nowhere to be seen. It's like he's not part of these decisions. Drew Rosenhaus, Hassan Reddick's agent, said that we dealt directly with Woody. It's like Joe Douglas isn't in charge anymore. It's like Joe Douglas is the GM in name only. And I've somewhat jokingly say this. I hope people don't get mad at me, but I've been calling him like he's like the Pluto of general managers. I don't know if you remember this. I may be dating myself, but about 18 years ago in 2006, we had 9 planets, and one of them was Pluto, the furthest away from the sun, and they took Pluto's planet status away. And this was like part of like a debate that had gone on for over 15 years in the scientific community. And so it was like, is Pluto a planet? We don't really know. Is Joe Douglas the Jets general manager right now? We don't really know. And the other thing, like the only other thing I could think of is like Woody's like looking for scapegoats left and right. So is Joe Douglas just like trying to hide from him? It was like an episode of Seinfeld where George Costanza was trying to prevent his girlfriend from breaking up with him. So he just started like avoiding her so she wouldn't see him, because if she didn't see him, she couldn't break up with him. It's like Joe Douglas like working under the assumption that if Woody Johnson doesn't see him, Woody Johnson can't fire him. And that was like the episode that, George changed his ringtone and had the song on it. I'll spare you my singing, but like I almost feel like if you call Joe Douglas and get voicemail right now, you'll hear, "Believe it or not, Joe isn't at home. Please leave a message at the beep." Just like if you remove yourself from this situation, if you forget for a second that you're a Jets fan, which I'm sure we'd all love to do, and just like look at this from a 30,000 foot view, it's kind of ludicrous. Like, where is Joe Douglas? Like, how does this team have a general manager who is like not involved in any of these major moves the team's making? The Jets under Woody Johnson, folks. As far as the other questions go, could Joe Douglas get another general manager job? I think it's possible because Joe Douglas has a great reputation in the NFL. Look, you remember what all the hype he got when he was hired. People love Joe Douglas in the NFL. And I think for Joe Douglas, it's going to be easy enough if he goes into job interviews and say, well, look, I drafted rookies of the year on the offensive and defensive side of the ball in the same draft. I drafted Breece Hall. Then the owner came in and ruined everything. And that's going to be very, like, if you're another NFL team, you're going to, I would believe it if Joe Douglas told me Woody Johnson screwed everything up. Very easy guy to blame because everybody knows. Woody Johnson's got a reputation in this league right now. And the last question is there any chance he could stay? Look, I've stopped trying to figure out what Woody Johnson's going to do. Nothing would surprise me right now with Woody Johnson. This is as erratic as it gets. So who knows? Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll take our attention away from the front office. We'll focus on an area where the Jets are really struggling on the offensive side of the ball, the run game. I think there are 3 issues right now with the Jets run game, and we'll talk about what they are continuing here on this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. When you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Things seem bleak right now for the New York Jets. They've lost 4 games in a row. They've fallen to 2-5. A season that had such promise with such expectations seems to be in bad shape. Still, the Jets going on the road this weekend are 6.5-point favorites right now on FanDuel against the New England Patriots. Speaks volumes about where the Patriots are in terms of talent and in terms of the situation in their locker room. But if you want to get in on the action, again, you can go to FanDuel. $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com. Again, that's FanDuel, FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday. We're doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question, John, I know you look at the all-22 regularly. Can you identify the problem with the run game? Every time they hand it off, it appears there are defenders immediately in the backfield. Do you think this is at least partly a scheme issue? So I think when you're struggling to the extent the Jets are in the run game, there's no one answer for it. I think there are 3 things going on right now. Number one, the run blocking is not very good. It's funny because I actually think the Jets, I said this earlier, I think the Jets are pass protecting pretty well. And I don't think the offensive line is really to blame for the passing struggles. Maybe there were a couple games, the Denver game, they were bad. The New England, the Minnesota game, they were a little shaky. But I think the last 2 weeks, Tyron Smith's been bad, but I think the other 4 guys are actually playing pretty well. I don't think they're playing well in the run game, though. And I think everybody's been pretty inconsistent. Elijah Vera Tucker was the guy I would have told you a week ago was probably the guy playing the best, most consistent ball. But he had a rough game, and now he's injured. So that's number one, is that they're losing in the trenches. Number 2, and this kind of goes hand in hand with it, it feels like there are a lot of plays where guys aren't sure of their blocking assignments. You look at, there's some hesitation in some of these guys. Sometimes you see them block the wrong guys. How do I know that? Well, there aren't that many run plays in the NFL, so you can kind of figure out what the assignments are. But there are also plays where you see like 2 guys are blocking the same defender and nobody's blocking. There's some other defender that's going unblocked. And, Keith Carter is a guy I've talked about a lot on this show. And I'm not impressed by by the job he does. And I understand that, it's difficult to grade position coaches because how much of it is the players, how much of it is the coach. But when I look at the degree to which the Jets are busting assignments up front, or when guys seem unsure, and even when guys hit the right assignment, sometimes you see hesitation where they're not going at full speed, and that's I think some of that's got to be on the coach, especially the offensive line coach, because offensive line's a spot where I actually do believe a position coach can make a big difference. And when guys are confused, a lot of times it's on the coach. And the third thing, and this one pays me to say, because I have been this guy's biggest fan since he arrived in 2022. But I think I have to say it. And I finally come to a conclusion on him. Breece Hall's not good at reading blocks. And me and many other people have said, Breece is a patient runner like Le'Veon Bell. He waits for his holes to open. But you know what? I've watched a lot of plays where he's patient and the hole opens and he still doesn't take it. When Breece is decisive, when he puts that foot in the ground, he can make a big play. He can still make it happen. And I'm not saying Breece Hall's a bad back. I'm not saying he's anything other than an asset. He's a home run hitter, and he might be the only home run hitter the Jets have on offense. And you saw him on Sunday night when he had 114 yards in the first half. The offense could actually do something. In the second half, they couldn't do anything. Breece Hall is a critical player for this offense, but he just is not good at reading blocks. And in the instances where he makes a good read, he makes it happen. But he just is too hesitant. He just it feels like he doesn't trust what he sees. And we're 3 years into his career. Again, he's an above average back to me. He's a guy who can make special things happen. But I'm ready to kind of wave the white flag on the idea that he's going to be a top 5 back. And I've been his biggest fan. I've been his biggest defender. I've made excuses for him, but I do think at some point you just have to say that, you know what, and there's nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with just being a good back who's a home run hitter who maybe has a weakness, and he's good in the receiving game also, but he's just not as good as I want him to be. He's not as good as we want him to be, and he's part of the problem. The blocking is also an issue, though. It's not just on Breece, but I do have to say this because I've been defending him. I've made excuses for him, and I don't know what it was, but watching the film after Sunday's game, something just finally clicked. I'm like, you know what? I see this an awful lot. I see him miss these holes. He's just not great at reading blocks. Great playmaker, great receiver, great threat. Makes this offense work when he's clicking, but yeah, just not what you need. Not what you need, but not what you need for a truly elite back. Next question: Jets are almost dead last in rushing attempts this season. With our running backs and tight ends, does that mean we are not even trying to run it? Why abandon the run? I would have to guess that that's a product of how often the Jets are behind. You ever watch ESPN or like one of the pregame shows? They'll give you some stat. This team is 15-1 since over the last 3 seasons when they run the ball more than they throw the ball. And it's like, no kidding. That's an effect, not a cause. You run the ball when you're ahead and trying to close games out. You throw the ball when you're behind. So I think that's part of it. I think another part of it's just the Jets haven't been running the ball effectively. So at some point you kind of have to, if your running game's not working, at some point you have to try and throw the ball. And part of it's, look, Rodgers is running a lot of this at the line himself. So if you want to blame somebody for, as much as I dislike Nathaniel Hackett, and look, I think if you look at like Todd Downing's approach the last 2 weeks, there have been many improvements. I think there are many ways Nathaniel Hackett was holding the offense back, but if you don't like the play calling, a lot of that's on Aaron Rodgers, because Aaron Rodgers has a lot of control at the line of scrimmage, just as any quarterback with Rodgers' stature would. But yeah, I don't think it's as simple as like the Jets are abandoning the run. I think there are reasons for it. And I think the number one reason is just they're behind so often in these games that they kind of have to. I think a lot of this is game situation dictating that. Next question. Can you point to things Bill Parcells did specifically for that short period of time which changed the course of this cursed franchise? Could it be replicated today somehow? Who could or would do it? It's difficult to say who's available right now because I'm not sure there's anybody with Parcells' stature at the moment who's available. You go back to 1997, that's the equivalent of like Andy Reid being unhappy in Kansas City and saying, you know what, I'm leaving. I'm going to take over the Jets. That's how big of a deal it was when it happened. Parcells is an all-time motivator as a head coach, but I think one thing you can't sell short is that Jets team was actually pretty talented. And this is like one of the things like people don't remember. Rich Kotite, the general manager, actually wasn't that bad. He actually built a pretty talented team. That was the 96 team that went 1-15. They drafted Keyshawn at wide receiver. They had signed Jumbo Elliott. They had guys like Aaron Glenn and Mo Lewis on defense, Marvin Jones. They had players. Wayne Corbett was on offense. That team actually was pretty talented. It was just the coaching was so unbelievably bad that they couldn't do anything. There was the legendary stories of Kotite leaving. Like NFL coaches. The NFL coaches sleep in their office. The stories of Kotite leaving to beat the rush hour traffic, leaving practice early to beat the rush hour traffic. There's one other story that I read that how coaches have the chart that tells them when to go for 2. If you're behind by 2, you go for 2. If you're behind by whatever, you go for 1. Kotite, there was a story. I think this happened when he was in Philadelphia, but there was a story of Kotite. The Eagles went for 2 at a point where it was completely nonsensical. And in the post-game press conference, he admitted that like what happened was the chart he had to tell them when to go for 2 and when to go for 1 based on game situation wasn't laminated. It was raining and the ink ran on the chart. I mean, that was Rich Kotite for you. So Parcells took over a situation that was it was a pretty talented team, but Parcells was an all-time coach. It was an all-time motivator. He brought instant credibility. It was somebody of like the stature of Andy Reid stepping in and saying and taking over the Jets. That's how big of a deal it was. For that to happen, Woody Johnson's going to have to be willing to hand over control to somebody else. And he hasn't been willing to do that. Now, at some point, will Woody get so embarrassed? And maybe this is the point. Like I ended yesterday's show on a really sad note because I was like, I don't know what the solution is. Let's be honest, spent a half hour bashing Woody Johnson. And I don't think anything I said on that show was unfair. Maybe the solution is Woody gets so embarrassed by his master plan here not working that he just says, you know what, I got to hand the keys over. That's all. That's the only way it'll work. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. If you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoyed the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow with Mike Debate of Locked On Patriots. We'll do crossover Thursday. Jets and Pats. We'll get you ready for that one. Can't wait to chat with you then.